We are here with Rachel Martin, who is an English teacher and trainer and curriculum designer, and she has also facilitated her share of conversation clubs, both online and face-to-face. So Rachel's going to share with us today some tools and tips and advice about facilitating online conversation clubs.
At the very least, a few thoughts about conversation clubs. Hi, Kim. Thanks for having me here.
Hello. So my first question for you is about the difference between teaching an English class and
Mhm.
facilitating a conversation club. How are they different for you as a teacher?
I think that is a great question to start out with because it can be really easy to confuse the two, especially, if you have students assigned to you, participants have to come at the same time. It can feel a little bit like a class. But I think it is very important to keep them separate because the goals are different, the structure is different, your priority as a teacher is different. So what is the difference there? When you're teaching a class, of course, you have many different dimensions. You have different goals depending on what you're doing, but you're usually integrating several different skills. You're integrating vocabulary and grammar and all of this stuff. And depending on how they've written the course objectives or how you have as the teacher, you have specific outcomes. Well, with a conversation class, you still have specific outcomes, but most of the time that outcome can kind of be boiled down to one sentence. Your goal is to get the participants to talk. And everything you do, from how you plan to how you facilitate in a conversation group, you want them talking. And that's going to influence how much you correct. That's going to influence how much you speak. I think for me, a big thing is I want participants to talk to each other. So I don't want everything to be facilitated through me or mediated through me. And of course, that's the same, I hope, in classes. But I think in a conversation group, the teacher takes an even further to the side role. You're not the focus. Getting your students to talk, that is what they're there to do, whether they do it right, wrong, imperfect, with vocabulary that makes sense, or it's just the vocabulary they know at that moment. If they can get their ideas across, they're there to talk.
I like that. It's a simplified, boil down to one thing they need to do, and that is talk. And so as a teacher, we have to put in all those other things we do in service to that goal, I guess.
You have to be comfortable letting some things go, stuff that you're used to bringing all into the lesson. Those dimensions aren't going to happen in a conversation group.
Thank you. Well, my next question is another comparison question. Thinking now about facilitating conversation clubs, what do you think is the difference between doing that in a face-to-face classroom kind of scenario or coffee shop or wherever you're doing it versus doing it online, which is really what our focus is on today, talking about how it works online. So how are those the same and different for you?
They're really different in a lot of ways. I think, good facilitation is good facilitation. You learn how to read people, you learn how to encourage them. But a lot of the logistics for online looks very different than it does in person. So let me give you a little bit of an example. I used to lead a weekly conversation group at an American space that had about 40 to 60 people attend every week. It was a huge group, maybe bigger than people think of as ideal for a conversation group. But it worked because we had a big enough room that it wasn't too loud. And some of our questions we would do in a whole group, but at least half of the time would be spent talking in smaller groups. So I'd get the conversation going. I would ask people to make groups of 4 to 6 participants. And then, I could rotate around. I could talk to them. Sometimes I'd have to ask them to share with the bigger group, but it was really easy to take 60 people and to turn it into 15 groups of 4. Now, when you move into an online space, I think the number of participants that you can really be successful with probably goes down. And I know that might seem backwards because I'm aware that many institutions have actually increased their class sizes when they've gone online. But specifically for conversation, you need to have a really good idea of what technology is available for you. So if all of your participants have strong internet connections and they have the right applications loaded, maybe you can use breakout rooms and you can still do that. Big group splits into small groups. But in my experience, I've had that go wrong probably more times than I've had it go right. I've lost a lot of time in conversation groups when I tried to directly transfer the same model. So when I'm online, I think my groups have to be a little bit smaller, really looking at a dozen or less. And I plan most of the activities to be whole group. In some settings, I plan everything to be whole group, which I don't know that I would have done that in face-to-face because I love to turn and talk to your partner, do small groups. It's a little bit different online because you don't want to lose 5 minutes transitioning people out and back, and then a third of your class doesn't get there. So know the technology, plan for maybe a smaller group, and definitely plan to keep them talking. You want to be very careful. I guess this is a similarity in some ways. You don't want one or two people to dominate the conversation. And I mean, that always happens in a conversation group based on personalities, but online, I think it can also be based on, internet connection strength or familiarity with technology. So sometimes if I know who all's going to be in the group, I'll make an order of speaking. I will just have a list that either I put on a slide and I can show, or if I don't know who's going to be there until the group starts, I put it in the chat. It's a little less natural to do that, but it does enforce the turn taking. Another thing I have to be really careful about online, and I think this is something I'm in the habit of from my face-to-face teaching, is really restating a lot of what the students say. So, if they say a phrase, even if they've said it correctly, I often will restate it again. And in a face-to-face classroom, that is often to make it louder so that everyone could hear what was said. Online, that isn't as necessary. And online, I feel like that really interrupts the flow of conversation. If everything that's said has to come back to me before it goes back to a student and then back to me, I don't want to play ping pong back and forth. I want them to talk to each other.
Yeah, I'm thinking still about the size of the group, and
Mm-hmm.
if everyone is there to speak and you have a pretty large group, you have to make sure and make sure everyone speaks. You really can't have 60 people because everyone's going to have maybe 25 seconds to say what they get to say in an hour session, for example. So yeah,
I
that's
always
something we
like
have
to
to
bring,
think about.
oh, yeah. I always like to bring just a little bit of math into my planning. Like if I have 45 minutes and 10 students, how much time are they spending active versus passive? And it is a conversation group. The goal is talking, but can I use the chat occasionally as another way that kind of a sidebar can be happening? If I can take them into breakout rooms, what amount of time do I want to spend in breakout rooms, knowing that sometimes the conversation, grinds to a halt really quickly. If I'm rotating between rooms, I guess being online just really forces me to think about how efficient I am being with all of my class time, but especially with regards to speaking in a conversation group. How is this worthwhile? Not just people logged in and used their data and sat here, but they were producing. It's supposed to be a productive activity.
So, question, you said you use math, right, to figure out how much are they active and how much are they passive? And that could be actively speaking, but maybe also active listening, somehow engaged in
Mm-hmm.
something happening. Do you have a number that you're looking for? Do you aim for a certain percentage of time that you want each person to be active? I'm just curious. I don't think there's a right answer, but
I don't think I have a perfect number. I just, I want to think about that in terms of, am I talking more than the students? I definitely don't want to be 50% or more. This isn't for me to practice my English. I need them speaking. Something else I've done, and this might sound kind of silly, but sometimes I will ask everyone to answer a question by muting their microphone and giving their answer or speaking. So I can have, 15 people in a room. Okay, for this next question, I want you to take a moment and think about your answer. And then I'm going to ask you to all mute your microphones and say your answer. And then, I can look around and I can see if they have cameras on, and if they don't, I still see that they're engaging when I see the mute go on and off. Maybe they already were muted, but then I might ask some people to share. And I think that at least gets them practicing speaking, using the muscles, forming the sounds, hearing English in their own voice. And hopefully that gives a few people the confidence to volunteer then. Once you've said it once, you can say it again. So that's not a perfect trick, but it is one of the ways that I try to make sure. I try not to go more than like 3 to 5 minutes without a person speaking, which is really hard because you don't want to cut people off. Let's say I have a really small group. I have 10 people in the room. Well, if each person answers the question, that's 10 minutes before we come back around and the first person gets to speak again. So that's another thing. I don't necessarily need every person to answer every question. If I ask a question, I could ask for 1 or 2 volunteers, then I call on 1 or 2 people, then I move on to the next question. And I try to have my class list in front of me. If I know who's going to be there, or I'll just write it on a paper when we start, and I'll just put a dot or a check mark next to their name every time they speak. And I do that, real quietly here off camera. And so I can kind of see if there's some people I should call on, or if I know that they're really hesitant and I don't want to put them on the spot. Sometimes I can be private chatting or messaging, or depending on the group, even WhatsApping with students while someone else is speaking. So there's a lot of multitasking.
That's something that I didn't do very much in face-to-face classes or conversation clubs, marking down student participation. Because I feel like I had a good sense of that, because I'd know where people's voices were coming from, and occasionally you would do it just to make sure that you're talking to everyone. But in an online setting, I find that to be invaluable, to have the list on paper in front of me of who's in the room and how much they're communicating. If I've heard from them at all through the class, if I can reach out to them in another way, like chat or text message or something. That's been a game changer for me in online working.
And it's easier to keep that list online, because when you are teaching a conversation group in person, it's happening in 360 around you. I think this is actually an advantage for online teaching or online conversation groups, is I only need to give my focus right here. So it's actually easier to catch all of that participation, and I can note it down pretty subtly, as opposed to, in the classroom. I believe a lot in taking notes because it really does help you to give feedback, but you don't want to be the person walking around with a big clipboard going, that's not encouraging conversation and making errors and trying. So I think online you can actually take notes a lot easier as long as you're subtle about it.
So when you transitioned from face-to-face teaching and facilitating to online, what were some of the challenges that you came across?
Oh, that's a great question. I can think of at least two things worth mentioning there. The first one, and it took me a while to feel comfortable with this because it was really different, is simply what silence looks like, what silence feels like in an online conversation group. It's awkward, let's be honest, especially if maybe your students don't have their cameras on. You're just looking at a bunch of little black squares and you ask a question and silence. That was a bit of a challenge for me. And wait time is always important. I mean, whether you are leading a face-to-face conversation group or an online conversation group, you really need to wait and you need to become comfortable waiting maybe longer than you instinctually first want to. But doing it online brings a whole different level, I think, because when you don't hear anything back, you don't know why it's taking so long. You don't know if there's been a technology interruption. Um, for me, I think it's pretty natural that you have this like instinct to want to immediately rephrase your question. Like I ask, silence, nothing. So I have to fight the urge to just keep talking and to either state the question again immediately or to start giving my own answer. But something to remember about online is how difficult it is to interrupt each other. The programs don't handle two voices at the same time very well. So really no one is going to talk in my conversation group until I stop and give them the space to do that. And you don't have all of the cues that you would normally have if you were face to face. If you were face to face with people, you can look and you can see if it's confusion, if it's hesitation. I think so much of being a good facilitator is reading your audience, reading your participants, and adapting to them in real time. And it's not the same to read and adapt to people online. That's kind of a different skill set. And it's harder. So building that empathy, like really paying attention to what's going on with the dynamics of your group, finding a way that you can kind of nudge people into speaking, all of that looks different because you don't have as much context. Usually I rely a lot on body language, on facial expressions. And so often my students online don't have their cameras on, or if they do and the video freezes or something, we're working in a lower context environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I realized when I taught face to face, I rarely cold called on
Mm,
people. Like I
yeah.
wouldn't just say, Rachel, tell me the answer.
Yeah.
I would, but I was reading people's body language to know,
Mhm.
okay, I feel like Rachel has an answer that she would be willing to share. And I can tell by your face and your body. And we don't have that online. So we have to be sometimes more direct, sometimes find other ways to make space for students. And yeah, it's a good challenge.
And that cold calling is such a delicate thing because you don't want to embarrass students, but you also don't want anyone to kind of escape or to just sit through the class like hoping that they don't get called on.
Yeah.
And, if we want to talk about classroom environment and all of that, I think it's very important even online. The other thing that I wanted to mention, I think this goes along with the low context, is how much more animated or how much more energetic I have to be. And I would encourage teachers to be online because when you're in a full classroom, you can walk over to a group, you can use your body language, you can use your face, your tone of voice, you have all of these dimensions. You were talking about watching the students, but you also use all of that, I think, to cue your students. Well, online, we're living in our little boxes here. We got to use that space as much as possible. So facial expressions, tone of voice, being aware of whether you're leaning forward to kind of show excitement or if you're sitting back to be very clear, I'm not going to talk now. Like I'm waiting for you. I often sit back. I think you're the one who actually taught me that one. How can we still use body language and bring more energy, bring a little bit more, maybe than is our natural tendency? Don't be afraid to have your hands on screen. Don't be afraid to nod along because your students, even if you can't see them, they can probably see you and they're going to respond to what they see on screen.
Mm-hmm. And to add to that, I think we do a lot of verbal feedback when people speak when we're face to face. So if you're talking, I might say, oh yeah, that's right. Yeah. And we've kind of trained ourselves to not do that because we know on Zoom or a lot of the conferencing software, it can't handle two audio inputs at once. So we're kind of trained ourselves to not do that, but we still need to let people know that we're listening, we're there, we're with them, we hear them, we understand them. And so we have to find new ways to make that work. And that might be body language, as you mentioned, it might be how you're leaning in or leaning back to make more space. And I think sometimes teachers think I'm asking them to change their personality or teaching style when I say, be more animated. But it's not that. It's just whatever your natural teaching style is, can you do it just a little bit more so your students have the gift of knowing that you are there with them and for them?
And I think that's a really good point about not changing who you are, but maybe modulating the delivery. Like, you're turning up the volume a little bit because you speak differently, one-on-one versus to in a small group versus to in a large auditorium. We do this naturally, or people do this because they've been trained. Public speaking looks a little bit different. Well, this is just another forum where, again, it's going to look a little bit different. We have to enlarge to fill the space, even if it is a small little box there. Something that's helped me a lot has been watching other people and seeing, just from my opinion, who looks comfortable on screen, who looks uncomfortable on screen, who has their framing all wrong or all wrong. I mean, I've been watching news reports, webinars, politicians, anyone who I see talking on Zoom, and I kind of like, in my head, I'm evaluating what are they doing that's working. So it might be something that I can adopt. If it suits me, I'm not going to take everyone's idea. Or what are they doing that really makes them look like they don't care or they're disinterested, or, what's something I want to make sure I'm not doing that? Because we have so many examples of people online today. We just need to find role models for good or for things we want to avoid.